You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Beit Shemesh Israel 5775, 2015. This week's Parsha is Parshas Tazria-Metzora. We have two Parshas together. The Parsha starts off, this is chapter 12, verse 1. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses and said, Daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, speak to the children of Israel and say as follows. Isha ki Tazria, when a woman shall conceive, the oldest zachar, and then shall give birth to a child, to a male. V'tama shivas yamim, so she becomes impure for 7 days. Kimei nidas d'vaisot titma, just like when she has her menstrual period, she's impure. So she's impure here as well for 7 days, even though she hasn't had her period. Verse 3, V'ayom hashmini, on the 8th day, yimol b'sar losai, there is an obligation to give this child, this boy, a circumcision. Now, the Torah, the verses continue, but I want to focus in over here on the concept of 7 days she's meant to count. She has to count those 7 days, whether it's for her menstrual cycle, or whether it's because she's just given birth. She has to count those 7 days before she becomes pure again, before she's permitted to be with her husband again. And then on the 8th day, the concept of 8. You have the 7, you have the 8. We've spoken in the past about the concept of 7 and 8. But there's an insight that I saw in the Medrash, that I understood from the Medrash, that I wanted to share, which really deepens the ideas here, deepens the concepts of 7 and 8, and deepens what the Torah is trying to tell us here in this description of a woman who conceives and gives birth. A few questions before we get into the Medrash, a few questions we can look at. It's really interesting that the way that the Torah describes the conception and birth. Usually we think about conception and birth, those are two separate stages. Conception happens at a certain point. 9 months later, you have the birth. The Torah doesn't really give us anything about those 9 months. It's just she conceives, she gives birth. It's just interesting that the time factor here is left out. Also interesting, what do I need to really know about the fact that she conceived, she gave birth? A woman has given birth. She counts 7 days, she's impure, and then on the 8th day, which l'chayra it seems has nothing to do with the 7 days that she's counted of impurity, but on the 8th day, it's really incidental that she's conceived and given birth. You could just talk about the fact that she's given birth. Why is the Torah describing it in this way? What's the understanding of it? Also, the numbers 7 and 8. 7 has to do with the fact that she's bleeding and she's not permitted to be with her husband. Doesn't seem to be connected so much to the concept of 8, which has to do with the bris. It's really also incidental. She has to count 8 days in regards to her son. She has to count 7 days in regards to herself, but they don't seem to be connected. Is there a connection? And if there is, what is the connection? Now, I'd like to share with you a medrash. And as we've spoken about in the past, the way of the medrash is that the medrash brings a verse, brings some pasuk, which at the end of the medrash, the verse is going to be used to explain the psukim, the verses that we're speaking about. But in the meantime, once the medrash has brought this pasuk, this verse, so it uses the verse to expound and expand and speak about concepts that at first do not seem to be related to the concept of the pasuk, the verse at hand. However, in looking in a deeper way, when we try to understand and we recognize that the Chazal, when our sages spoke, they never randomly placed concepts next to each other, but rather somehow these concepts are connected, and one concept explains the other in such a way that we can get a greater depth in the teaching that we're trying to understand here on this very verse. So if we come into it with that understanding, so the Medrash always teaches us something very profound and deep. So the first Medrash on the Parsha, it says like this, Isha ki Tazria. So Hadahu dichsiv, this is what it means in the verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, chapter 139, verse 5, Achor v'kedem tsartani. This verse is actually a pretty opaque verse, but the literal translation of the verse is that God formed me before and after, or actually after and before. Now the Medrash goes to great lengths to try to explain what does it mean that Hashem created me, God created the human being before and after, or after and before. What is this idea? So before we get into the whole Medrash, I want to fast forward to the end of the Medrash, because it's instructive to look at that first and see why is this verse being brought over here? What is the connection to after and before and the creation over here? Obviously, there's something to do specifically with our verse. The verse is speaking about Isha ki Tazria, when a woman conceives and she gives birth. Right, so we're speaking about the conception and creation of a human being, of a person. Now the Medrash says that, at the end of the Medrash, it says that the previous verses, the previous psukim, were speaking about the Torah, the concept of animals. Which animals are permitted to eat, which animals are forbidden to eat. And the Medrash tells us that there's an aspect of after. When it comes to the human being, the Torah first speaks about the animals. First speaks about the Torah, the concepts of the Torah which are connected to animals. And then, only then, does the Torah speak about the aspects that are related to the human being. The aspects of the human being's birth, the aspects of the circumcision that need to take place if it's a boy, what happens if it's a girl, etc. But the Torah specifically puts it in this order. We find another place in the Torah where it's in this order, and that's in the creation of the world. Hashem, when He created the world, when God created the world, so the animals were created first. The birds were created first. All of the plant life, when man was created, was on the 6th day. The human being came into the world on the 6th day. So really, in a certain sense, Adam Harishon, the man, the human being, is last. Now, of course, in another sense, and perhaps this is the depth of the verse, the depth of the Medrash here, the beginning of the depth, the human being is created first, meaning Hashem is creating all these things along the way. Days 1 through 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the animals, all these things are being created for the human being. So that means that Hashem has in mind the human being before. But in another way, the soul of the human being is actually created on the first day. So before even though, yes, the body of the human being was created on the 6th day, and the soul was joined with the body on the 6th day, so his first conscious experience is after everything. But at the same time, his creation, the soul, his neshama, was created on the first day. So the Medrash says that there's a sobering fact that we can deduce from this, the way that the psukim have ordered the Torah, the concepts of the animals versus the human being, from the fact that the human being was created last. Im zacha adam, if a person merits, amrim lo ata kadamta l'chol ma'aseh bereishis. So then they say to the person, if a person does what's right, if a person purifies himself, if a person is involved in Torah and spirituality, etc., so they say to him, you were there, you came before all of creation. V'im lav, but if not, amrim lo yitush kedamcha. They say to that person, a mosquito was created before you. Meaning, if a person is egotistical, if a person doesn't seek spirituality, if a person is all involved in himself, so then they say, you think you're so great. There was mosquitoes that were created before you. So that's the aspect of the physical part of the human being. But if a person does what's right, if it connects to spirituality, if it connects to his higher self, to his soul, so then they say to him, you were created first. The whole world was created for you. Now let's back up for a moment and look back at the beginning of the Medrash. Because the Medrash speaks about stuff that doesn't at first seem to be connected, but clearly is connected. Let's see, it says like this. Brings this verse, Achar v'kelem sartani. Man was created after and before. Amar Reb Berechia. Reb Berechia said to Reb Chelbo Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, to Rabbi Chelbo and Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, B'shoshe bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Adam Harishon. When God created man, he was created in such a way that he encompassed the entire world. He was able to see from one end of the world to the other. He was transcendent. It says he was from the east to the west. It brings a verse. From north to south. It brings another verse. And of course, we need to understand, what does it mean that Adam Harishon, he was so big, he was so large, he encompassed the entire world, he was a spaceship, what does this mean? What does the Medrash mean when it says that he was so encompassing? Now, before we continue and read another aspect of this Medrash, it's important to come back to the question of, what is the Medrash here trying to do? Why are we connecting to Adam Harishon, to the way that he was created? Why are we speaking about this? So, I mean, we get the beginnings of it because we already explained that we have here this Medrash is trying to tell us how, in a certain sense, the human being is not as chashuv as, not as significant as when a person doesn't do what they're supposed to do, when they don't value spirituality, they're less significant than an animal. But, and we see that as well in the way that Hashem created the human being. So we have that connection already. But there's more, there's deeper connections here. And one of the connections is that we find that when a child is developing, it's a fetus inside of its mother, So Chazal tell us, our sages say, that Hashem gives it a light. It's actually a reference to this in the Medrash also over here. It doesn't say the whole thing that the Gemara says, but there's a light that's over its head. Hashem shines a light over its head with which it can see from one end of the world until the other. So clearly a baby inside, the baby, also thinking about like, why don't I remember when I was a baby inside of my mother? Why does a child not remember something that happened so recently, right? But part of it has to do with the fact that it's in a space, a transcendent space. Just like Adam HaRishon was all-encompassing, a child, when it's inside of its mother's womb, its experience, its consciousness is such that it is all-encompassing. Our sages tell us the child is being taught all of the Torah, which is also a way of our Chazal, our sages, referencing the fact that it's in a space consciously, which is beyond, it's in a transcendent place. So we already see that there's these parallels between a child and the way Adam HaRishon was created, between the child in that space of Ki Tazria-Metzora, in between the time when the child is conceived until the woman gives birth. That baby is in a space which is beyond time. So that could be the beginnings of an explanation why the Torah refers to these with that kind of like skipping the time, skipping the process, skipping the 9 months, because that child, when it's experiencing that 9 months, so the child experience is transcendent, it's beyond time. So there's another reference to this idea in the Hamshech, in the continuation of the Medrash. The Medrash says, Al daita di Reish Lakish, the Medrash quotes an opinion which is Reish Lakish, but according to his opinion it says, Dichsiv, that which it says, V'ruach Elokim rachefes al pnei hamoyim. In Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis, it speaks about the fact that God's Spirit, as it were, was hovering above the water. Hashem had just created the heavens and the earth, and there's water, and God's Spirit is hovering above. What's this God's Spirit? What's that a reference to? Zeh ruchei shel melech HaMashiach. The Spirit is a reference to the Spirit, the neshama, the soul of the Messiah. Now, what's very interesting, the Eitz Sissi brings down, the Zohar says, it's something that we quoted in the past, that Adam HaRishon, the soul of Adam, his soul is Adam, is 3 letters, is Aleph, Dalet, and Mem. And it represents the fact that the soul of Adam would reincarnate twice. First time, the first incarnation was Adam HaRishon, the first man himself. The second incarnation, the reincarnation, was in David. The second letter of Adam is a Dalet, which stands for David. And then the final incarnation, the second reincarnation, is in Mem, is Mashiach, the Melech HaMashiach, the Messiah who's going to come and usher in that age of the Messiah. So that soul, the soul of Adam HaRishon, that all-encompassing soul, which one day will come into the world again and bring the world back to its state of perfection that Adam HaRishon experienced when he was in the Garden of Eden, that soul already existed on the first day of creation, the very beginning. Now, hold on to that thought. Hold on to this idea that the soul of the Messiah is already there before. There's something here that's beyond time, that's beyond space. Hold on to that concept. And the way that the Medrash works is that the Medrash will take a verse and we'll go through sections, piece after piece after piece, explaining that verse, and then we'll come to an end and then move on to a different verse. Now, at the very end of this whole section, explaining this verse of Isha Ki Tazria, when a woman conceives and then gives birth, the very end, it says something which is remarkable, and I think gives a tremendous depth to what's going on here. Says the Medrash, in this world, Isha Yeledes B'tzar, a woman, when she gives birth, she experiences pain. Le'asid lavai, but in the future, Maksiv, what does the verse says? This is a verse in Isaiah 66, verse 7. B'terem tachil yalada, b'terem yavai chevala v'gomer. The verse speaks about the fact, and it's a mashal over there in the verse. If you see the verse itself, it's speaking in an analogy, speaking really about the kibbutz galius, the ingathering of the exiles. But the analogy that it uses is that in the future, the experience of a woman when she gives birth will be that before she even has any pain, before she has any childbirth trauma, she will have given birth already. Meaning, the pain, the challenge, the process that we have today won't be there in the future time. And it's something that we find that Adam HaRishon Kodem Achet, the first man before the sin, when they, in the Garden of Eden, the Talmud tells us, the Gemara says, that man and his wife got up on the bed there were 2 of them. They came down from the bed. There were 4 of them. It was immediate. There was no process. The Ki Tazria-Metzora. There's a hint here in the verse of Ki Tazria-Metzora that there's no time. The ideal is that there's no time between the conception and the birth. That's how it was when Adam HaRishon was in the garden with his wife. Immediately they conceived, they gave birth. There was no time. There was no process. And that's how it's going to be in the future. When the Messiah comes, when we get into that space of Olam Haba, the world to come, so the conception and the birth will occur immediately, one after the other, without that 9-month period. Now, in thinking about this, I was just struck by the fact that the process here, the way that it works is that there's a first stage, there's an initial state, which is that the way it was at the beginning, no process. There's a fall from grace, there's a fall from that perfection, that perfected state, and now there's a necessity for there to be process. But ultimately we return to that place where there is no process. Now, if we look at the medrash that we quoted earlier, we think about the fact that Adam HaRishon, the first man, his soul was created first, before everything. So there was a state of perfection. There was a state of a lack of process in a certain sense. The soul was there, all-inclusive, beyond, transcendent. And in fact, the soul of the Messiah, which is the end of the story, was already there at the beginning. Everything was in a state of perfection without process. Now, there's a 6-day process. There's 6 days. Adam HaRishon, his physical body is created on the 6th day, and he comes into the world, and the consciousness of Adam HaRishon, the way that he perceives reality, is not that he was there before. He perceives himself as a physical being, or as a physical and spiritual being combined, but it's after a whole process of creation. Now, when he comes in, what does he experience? What does he see? Everything is done already. In other words, his first experience is kind of the original thought of God. God on the first day, when it says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, he's already has the whole idea, as it were, so to speak, in his head. Right? Hashem has the whole creation already, and he's doing it for man. Adam HaRishon comes into the world on the 6th day after the whole process, and his experience is the final product. So you have this perfection, this state of non-process, which is the soul is created in that space. Then you have a process of 6 days. On the 6th day, again you return in a certain sense to that everything is already done. There is no process. His experience is of no process. And then we continue to see this kind of back and forth. Stuff starts in a perfected state, no process. When Adam HaRishon, before they sin, there's no process in the creation of a child. Conception, birth, that's it. Nothing more, no process. No 9 months. Fall through that sin, and now there's process. And then, eventually, the process is no longer necessary. Now in thinking about this and thinking about it, so when we look at what happens, the concept of 7 represents the process. It's the 7 days of the week. It's the 6 days. It's the 6 days of work. It's the 6 days of efforts that we put in. Yes, Shabbos is a day of rest. It's a day that we sit back and we enjoy the efforts that we've put in all those 6 days. But the 7 represents the physical world as we experience it, which is that there's process and there's continuing process. The number 8, what's interesting about the number 8 is that it's not a number that actually comes after 7. The number 8 represents the composite, the oneness of those 7. So the number 8 is transcendent. It's the picture. It's the face that includes all the different parts, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, but it's the face. It's the coming together of all those pieces and creating a oneness which is beyond the pieces themselves, the parts themselves. But here's the chiddush, here's the novelty, the new idea, the deeper depth, which is that the 8 is not a number that's after 7. The 8 is a number that's before and after 7, really encompassing 7. It's the number that represents all of the pieces in thought before it's actually come into reality. And it's the number that represents the return back to that place where there's a completion and there's no process necessary. So now look at the pasuk, look at the verse again, the verse that we read at the very beginning, and see something amazing. The verse says, chapter 12, verse 1, Vaydaber shel Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses and said, pasuk Beis, second verse, Daber al bnei Yisrael lemor. Speak to the people of Israel. Isha ki Tazria. When a woman shall conceive Yolda Zachar, and immediately she will give birth. Right? That's the initial stage of reality, when there's no process. V'tama shivas yamim. But when there's a fall, so there's a necessity for there to be a process, a counting of 7 days. When you count those 7 days, kimei nidas the voice of the titma, just like when she menstruates, there's a separation, there's a counting, there's a process. But in the respecting of the process, what happens? Uvayoyim hashmini. On the 8th day, it's not disassociated, it's not disconnected. After there's a counting of those 7 days, there's a return to the 8th aspect. Yimol b'sar alasoi. There's a removal of the foreskin. And that concept of the 8th, that concept of the 8th day, the concept of the removal of the foreskin is representative of the fact when a person has a taiva, when a person has a desire, and the foreskin represents sexual desire. When a person has desire, so why is it necessary? It says that when Adam Arishon and Chava, when they were in the Gan before the sin, so there was no taiva. There was no desire. It was just like a person who needs to drink a cup of water. You know, you're thirsty, you drink the water, and that's it. You're done. And so too, that's the way it was when it came to their intercourse, when it came to their relations. You know, if we think about it, it's like if you know that when I involve myself in this particular act, it's going to create a child. You see the results immediately. So that itself would be motivation enough in order to create, for them to have relations. They would have this child. But today, because we live in a time where it takes this whole process, there's this whole long and arduous process, the 9-month process for the child to come into reality. So Hashem instills it into us that we have to have a taiva. We have to have this lust, this need to come into this relations. Otherwise, the world wouldn't continue to exist. The human beings and animals wouldn't propagate themselves. So, but the taiva is only there. It's only necessary because we live in a world where there's process. If there wouldn't be that need for the process, there wouldn't be a need for the taiva. But by removing the foreskin, it's a recognition that it's possible to be in a space, to return to the space of 8, to that transcendent space, to that place before taiva, before process, or more accurately, beyond process. And the way that occurs in our world is by respecting process. When a person goes through that time when it's forbidden to be with their spouse, there's a respect for the process, there's a respect for time, there's that counting, and that respects the time and the process. Now a person can return back to the state of 8, to the state of oneness, to the state of unity. I want to bless you, please bless me back. Hashem should help us to be able to recognize that we live in a world of process, but it's possible to access that space which is beyond process, and that occurs through the respecting of process. Zacha, if a person merits, so then they say to him, you were created before, at the very beginning, you have returned to the space which is beyond process. But if a person doesn't respect process, doesn't fulfill the words of the Torah that help us to start respecting the process, then they say to that person, the mosquito was created before you. May we merit to indeed be among those who are able to be told that you have merited to be created before and return to that space. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.